How many people are losing money selling PSA slabs on eBay? What's up, guys? We're going to be doing a deep dive into PSA's new consignment store that just opened up on eBay. It's been up and going for about a little over a month and a half. And the thought really crossed my mind. How many people are submitting cards to PSA and flipping those cards for lower than the cost of grading? It's going to be a little bit difficult to find this information compared to what we used to be able to do with eBay Terapeak data. We have to get a little bit clever with eBay here, but we're going to do a couple of deep dive searches and try to answer that question. Why am I interested in this? And the thought has crossed my mind. How many people are actually losing money doing this on eBay? So we've got our eBay page pulled up here. Now, what this is going to do is really give us a good understanding of how many cards are selling on eBay. And we're looking at a total denominator or volume of sales. Right now, you can see we're looking at about 1.3 million. Now it's over a specific time frame. How far back does eBay completed sales go? It's about 90 days. So we're gonna assume that this is about a 90-day search back period. So over a 90-day period, roughly 1.3 million cards sell on eBay. That means sold, not listed. Now, what's the next search query? I wanna look at how many of these cards do not cover the cost of grading. The assumption is most of those cards were recently submitted to the eBay consignment business from a grading desk hand and offloaded to eBay's consignment business, meaning they were freshly graded. They're not cards that were graded many years ago. So because of that, I'm using PSA's most recent fee structure, which they had a $15 special or promo in June. So I'm going to assume, I'm giving these people the benefit of the doubt that they use the $15 promo, which is not the case. This is a very conservative analysis. So whenever I look at this, I'm really looking at how many cards have sold below $15. So you can see the baseline population of cards that sell on eBay over a 90-day period, roughly 230,000 cards sell at $15 or below. I'm calling that below the cost of grading. This is not factoring in the cost of the card itself. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So you could say roughly 230,000 cards out of the 1.3 million cards that sell on eBay sell below the cost of grading. That's about 20%, actually just about less than 20% of the cards sell below the cost of grading. All right, let's go over to PSA's consignment business. And as we look at the PSA store, they are selling a lot of cards. They have sold 44,000 cards to date. And they really kicked this off to the public in the past month and a half. They have sold roughly 44,000 cards, presumably, since they opened business. Now, this is going to continue to get extrapolated once we hit that 90-day period because they have not been open for 90 days, I don't believe. So this is going to continue to grow, which means their denominator of volume of sales is going to continue to mature. And as that matures, it's going to be a much better reflection of the overall submission volume flip game that is out there, meaning members who are submitting their cards for grading and then sending them straight for consignment. Another thing that you could really do is look at the individual cards and see if they're fresh serial numbers to actually get a good gauge on whether or not these cards were actually graded recently or not. We can't do that for 44,000 cards, right? It's a lot. So roughly 44,000 cards have sold on eBay's consignment business. How many of those cards have sold for less than the cost of grading? Let's find out. We have 15,000. That's 15,000 out of 44,000. That is just about 1 out of every 3 sells for below the cost of grading or at the cost of grading. Again, over the past month, grading fees have been $18.99 for most cards out there on the marketplace. So this is a very conservative estimate, assuming, giving the submitters the benefit of the doubt that they submitted at the $15 special. We know that that is not always the case. Just for the heck of it, I wanted to look and see how many of these cards are actually selling for $25 or less, with the assumption that the grading fee is $15. Let's assume that the average cost of the card itself is $10. Now, I don't know what the average cost of all these cards are. But let's just say $10. So 10 plus 15, 25. How many cards are selling for less than $25? It's 23,000. That is just over 50% of the cards that are selling. If you assume that the average cost of the card is $10, that they're basically break even or less. That's pretty bad. That's pretty bad. Now we can break this down by sport. We're going to do that a little bit later on. Interestingly enough, I also wanted to look and see just at the $50 mark. So are most of these cards really high end, or are a lot of people selling kind of low end stuff? So if you look at cards that are selling for $50 and less, it's 33,000 out of 44,000. That is exactly 75%. So 3 out of every 4 are selling for $50 or less. If you go to my eBay store, you'll see that the average sales price for anything that I sell, and I sell $1 raw cards all the way up to several $1,000 cards, the average sales price usually hovers around $120. And for me, that is very healthy. To see this, and again, this is not average necessarily, because as you get to that top third above, $50 and above, that's really going to skew this data out, and it's going to skew the average out. So I don't know what the average is. I guess we could use Terapeak for that. But roughly 1 out of every 4 cards is selling above $50. 3 out of every 4 are selling for less than 50. Okay, now let's break this down, because we want to really also narrow this down to, is this people who really don't know what they're doing grading, meaning they're getting bad grades back and that's the reason why, or is there something else? So the only thing that I can really do to take a look at this is look at the volume of PSA 10s that are out there. So this is kind of the setup for that. We have the search term PSA 10 with completed sales on PSA's page. Again, 15,000 cards have sold on eBay's consignment store as a PSA 10. That's, again, in my opinion, a very low percentage. You can kind of go through and see there's a lot of Pokemon stuff, a lot of TPG, a lot of TPG, and that could really be skewing the data. So we're going to dig into that just briefly. So 15,000 PSA 10s. How many of those PSA 10s do you think are below the cost of grading? Let's see, probably not much. 1,700, which is a little bit surprising. I would not have expected there to be that many cards that are selling below the cost of grading. So that's a little bit surprising. Let's just take a quick glance through and see who in the world is grading a 2023 Panini Select certified Jason Tatum insert card. I mean, I just don't get it. Now, the Ohtani offseason tops now, first Dodger thing. There's a lot of cards out there that are not worth getting graded. So you could say this is an overall gauge of how well people are at picking cards that should be sent off to grading in terms of gauging that overall ROI. And right now, I would say, just based on everything we've seen so far, people are very bad at this. They're not great in aggregate. That does not mean that there are not people who can do really well with this. But if you're the average person doing this, I don't think that you're doing very well. If we look at PSA 8s and PSA 9s, now that is a significant volume of the sales that are PSA 8s and PSA 9s. So 21,000 out of the 44,000 is almost 50% of those cards that are PSA 8s and PSA 9s. So overall gem rate, now you can see there's some vintage stuff in here, so we don't really expect that stuff to really get graded at very, very high grades. So it's almost like you should exclude those, but there's really not a good way to do that without having to enter a lot of search terms. How many of these PSA sales have been sports cards? This could probably marry up pretty well with gem rate data as well. So if we look at sports, we're going to narrow this in. You can see roughly 27,000 cards were sold as sports cards. So that means roughly about, quick math off the top of my head, 17,000 cards were non-sports cards or TCG or other. So we're only going to focus on sports cards. That's all that I care about. So 27,000 sports cards. All right, out of those PSAs that sold for less than $15, let's click sports and let's see what that looks like. So 9,800 cards sold for less than $15 out of the 27,000 that is getting graded. I can't think of that percentage off the top of my head. It's not exactly a third. It's a little bit more than a third, maybe closer to 40%, but it's somewhere in that high 30s, low 40s percentage. So maybe it's a little bit better than the overall. So maybe Pokemon is kind of bringing that down just a little bit. All right, if we look at the ones that sell for under $25, we've got 14,000. So 14,000 out of 27,000. Again, that's just above 50%, give or take. So it's like 52, 53%. It's a lot of cards that are basically not doing very well. Yeah, not great. 14,000, yikes. All right, what about $50? Let's click sports. 20,000, so 20,000 out of the 27,000 cards sell for less than 50 bucks. Okay, how many of the sports cards were PSA 10s? Again, 15,000 PSA 10s out of the 44,000 that have sold on their store. Let's look at sports. It is 8,800, so 8,800 out of the 27,000 sports cards were PSA 10s. And then let's look and see if any of these sports cards that sold less than $15 were sports. Let's see what that overall number is. So 809. It's a little bit lower of a percentage. Less than 10% of the PSA 10s are selling less than the cost of grading, so to speak. So thought this would be a pretty interesting analysis. Again, my key takeaway from this is overall, in aggregate, people who submit to PSA to flip, specifically via this consignment model, in my opinion, are not doing that well. Roughly a third of them, based on this data, are not covering the cost of grading. If you assume that the average cost of the card that is getting submitted for grading is $10, then you're looking at roughly 50% of the cards that are getting submitted for grading and then consignment are getting sold for roughly about the cost of the card and grading. The other piece to this that is not considered is this does not take into account the fee structure. And this has been the major holdup in me putting out content in a video about the consignment model. The majority of these cards that are selling for less than $50 are exposed to a significant fee structure. And that fee structure is not taken into consideration at all in this analysis. So go ahead and add more percentage points to all these numbers in terms of people who are not covering their costs when they're grading cards and submitting them for consignment. So the vast majority of people, if you assume $25 is a break-even point, the vast majority of people submitting are not covering that. It's over 50%. So in my opinion, people need to do a lot better. All right, let me know what you all think down below. Do you all like this type of content? This is a little bit different than the mail day. So let me know what you think, and we will see you next time.